Hello, everyone. So this is our English version of the presentation, Policy Measures to Address Single-Use Plastic Bags in Egypt. One small step towards cleaner and healthier cities for post-COVID-19. This is a presentation of the outcomes of a study that has been going on for the past few months, implemented by CDERI, Center for Environment and Development for the Arab Region and Europe, and in cooperation with JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, and in coordination with the Ministry of Environment of Egypt. So this study has been going on for a few months now, and we were at the start hesitant about whether we should focus on this topic in the middle of a pandemic that's going on or not. After some discussion, we realized that actually, yes, it is more important than ever to address everything that can improve the quality of environment in our cities, as more studies reveal every day that cities with higher pollution are more vulnerable to disease and more vulnerable to complications. And actually, quite ironically, in the month of March, where the outbreak was starting to really catch on in Egypt, we were invited to a conference by the Egyptian Respiratory Society. The poster you see now is of the 2019 conference, because 2020, of course, was canceled, was in March. But I'm showing this to repeat a message that was delivered by the General Secretary of the Congress of 2019, Professor Jihan El-Assel, in her presentation in one of our conferences about fuel quality and air pollution. And she pointed out the importance of air pollution and its impact on the vulnerability of cities to both contract diseases, to develop faster, more rapid complications, and respond slower to treatment. This was in 2019, and it was a conference that we were holding about air pollution, and they realized the importance of the authorities and the NGOs and so on that are working on environment. They realized this because the preventive measures can really go a long way in reducing respiratory diseases in Egypt. So in their 2020 conference, that was the reason why we were invited. Unfortunately, it was, of course, canceled. We were invited because it was the initiation of this link and bridging the gap between those working in environment and those working in the front lines of respiratory diseases. The focus of the presentation would have been about the two big issues in Egypt related to air pollution, which is fuel quality and open burning of waste, among many other sources of pollutions, which we actually share with many other mega cities around the world. There are many shared challenges. If we look at the distribution of sources of air pollution in Egypt, a very large portion comes from vehicle emissions, and this is why we care very much about that. And a very large portion comes from open burning of waste. And both of these are improving. There's a lot of steady progress, and our role is to accelerate this together. So obviously waste must be reduced. Improved collection is important, and law enforcement. Among the very challenging issues in open burning of waste is plastics, which is quite noxious in its emissions. Obviously, the less plastics, the better. When we are talking today in this presentation about plastic bags, this is definitely a very small piece of a very big puzzle. And we would encourage you to go through our website, CDERI, or our YouTube channel, CDERI Online, to learn more about many other pieces of the puzzle that we are working on, whether vehicle emissions, fuel quality, electric mobility, waste, sustainable secondary resources, and so on. So back to our presentation today, it's about plastic bags and this small piece of the puzzle, and how much does it mean to air pollution and other types of impacts on the environment. In fact, new research shows that long-term exposure to air pollution could contribute to higher numbers of COVID fatalities. And also there's further research investigating function as a carrier as well. And every bit counts when we're talking about reducing waste. Let's start with a global overview of single-use plastic items in general and the waste production. If we would measure the amount of plastic wastes that's being generated in every country, the size of the pie charts would look as you see in this map. And if we would indicate the portion in red, the portion of the waste that is mismanaged, this is how it would look like, showing countries that still have a lot of challenges, such as China, Indonesia, Egypt, and so on, and countries that are a bit further ahead, but also reminding us that despite this situation, there are countries that have less overall production of waste. So if you compare with other countries such as Japan with similar populations, there is much more plastic waste, but improved management compared to the rest of the world. So it's not just about the portion that is mismanaged, but the overall quantity. One of the big challenges that happened in the world recently is that China stopped the import of waste, which a lot of it was coming from the US, but also other countries, including Egypt. And this was a sort of stimulation of recycling industries and many countries scrambling to find new solutions to accelerate their progress towards reducing waste, reusing, and recycling, and so on. So this was a big change and shift that happened recently. One of the usual questions that we're being asked is, should Egypt be focusing on this issue, which seems more like a luxury that we cannot afford? We should focus on more important issues. There are actually many other countries, even with lower income, maybe half as much income per capita, that have been addressing similar issues because they actually found that the impact of the plastics on farmers, on tourism, etc., is a bigger burden than any burden that would be brought forth from restrictions, for example, or placing a price on plastic bags or banning free retail distribution and so on. It does have a cost, but many countries have discovered that the cost to farmers, to poor segments of society, have been high. And many laws and regulations, this is actually an old picture in Kenya. Kenya now is one of the very good examples of best practice in terms of addressing single-use plastic items and reducing plastic waste. Because of many measures that were implemented, such as restricting the free retail distribution of bags that I will be talking about shortly. So the threats are clogging waterways, impact on nature reserves and tourism, open dump sites and open burning, causing air pollution, and so on. And once more, many countries, such as maybe starting in the year 2000 in Bangladesh, at that time one of the very low-income countries, a country of very rapid progress, to more recently countries like Rwanda and Kenya that have been implementing very stringent measures to address single-use plastic items. Let's have a global overview. There have been 127 countries globally introducing some sort of regulation for plastic bags, 83 banning free retail distribution. So free retail distribution means you go to a supermarket, you get the bag for free. So 83 countries have banned free retail distribution. And this, by the way, did not, I mean, as much as it was a restriction, it also stimulated industries elsewhere. So it stimulated the production of better quality bags, stimulated the production of multi-use bags of different types, and so on. So with every door closed, another door is opened. If we're talking about the private sector, employment, industrial development, innovation, and so on. So this is the other side of banning something, which they have been experiencing in many countries that have carried out these measures. So 27 have banned specific products, material or production levels. 43 have different elements of extended producer responsibility in place, which includes deposit refunds, product take-back and recycling targets, and so on. If you look at updates, case studies in the European Union, China, India, the US, Kenya, South Africa, Rwanda, and many other countries, there has been a lot of further progress even in the past few months. So what does it look like in Egypt? We have consumption of 14 billion plastic bags per year. And the segmentation of the market looks as follows. So there are large portions going to groceries, the small groceries, vegetables and fruit salesmen, which is very difficult to address, and large supermarkets, about 14%, and stores and shops, 17%, and the others being stationaries, pharmacies, ready-made clothes factories, and so on, fast food restaurant chains, and so on. This is not only an issue for littering, for the urban environment, I mean, but also an issue for marine and river pollution. And these are the main environmental impact categories of interest that we have discovered when we've been looking into the case studies of the cities along the Red Sea. Another important issue to note is our import dependence when we're talking about plastics. So most of the single-use plastic bags are made of polyethylene, and Egypt, like with many other plastics, is highly import dependent on this material. About 70% of total consumption is being imported, actually. Let's have a look at the flow of material in a second. But first, an industry overview. The industrial players in Egypt look as follows. Close to 5,000 registered plastic processing units. 40% are small scale, and we have a very challenging issue that a very large part of the industry is informal. We don't know how much is informal, but estimates say, through discussions with the plastic technology centers and stakeholders, estimates say that more than 4 times informal production. So single-use plastic bags are produced in about 1,400 formal factories. Once more, about 4 times these factories are informal, and this gives you an idea of the challenges that will be faced when you start implementing various regulatory measures. It is responsible, the plastic industry is responsible for quite a significant part of the job market. It employs 424,000 people directly or indirectly, quite a decent annual growth. And the consumption is about $9.35 billion plastic products in 2019, with a decent growth rate. Packaging industry accounts for 38% of the total consumption of raw materials of plastics. The industry is classified into manufacturing of polymers, petrochemical industry, and conversion of polymers into plastic articles, micro, small, and medium units. The the geographical distribution of production of plastic films is as follows, showing that the majority of production would be found in a little bit in Upper Egypt, such as in Suhag, but also mostly in Cairo, Alexandria, and Sharqiya. Other governors being Al-Ubayya and Munifeh. So these are, this is the geographic distribution of the plastic film production in Egypt. But a more important mapping would be the mapping of the flow of the material of plastics, of polyethylene specifically. So of all the plastics going into plastic products and materials, as we mentioned before, about 70% is imported polyethylene. Local manufacturing is also abundant. And if we look into the equipment, the vast majority of the equipment is being imported and only 10% is locally assembled. This all leads to about 480,000 tons of polyethylene packaging producers, packaging products. About 45% of polyethylene is being recycled, so we have quite a decent percentage of recycling of polyethylene as well. So this is the mapping of the flow of polyethylene in Egypt, conducted with Plastic Technology Center in 2020. Large import dependence, whether on the material or if we're talking about the equipment. So how have the development of regulations been since year 2000, so over the past 20 years? So it was as follows. In the case of Egypt, there have been regulations in place since the year 2000 addressing marine litter, and also later in 2008, but there's a difference in regulations or the legal instruments that have been implemented, whether the decrees issued by the governors have been published in an official gazette or not, and what authorities do these decrees have, and what level of enforcement do they have. And these varied a lot, and I will be talking more about this in the analysis later. There have been several voluntary initiatives as well going on since the year 2000, over the past 2 years, such as big retailers, big hypermarkets, and also a lot of leadership shown by the Hurghada Environmental Protection and Conservation Association, HEPCA, the Red Sea, among others. 2016 National Action Plan development for Sustainable Consumption and Production, Sustainable Public Procurement Guidelines developed by SUPB in cooperation with the Ministry of Environment. Also a study on single-use plastic bags consumption reduction. In 2017, activity continued in refreshing and updating the assessment of plastic items in Egypt, single-use plastic bags in Egypt, and lots of awareness activities. 2018 might have been a climax of environmental awareness activities, since this was the year of the theme of plastic and marine litter. The World Environment Day every year has a theme, and the theme for 2018 was plastics and addressing the challenges of plastic. And in Egypt, the activities that were done in this respect were a lot, and there was a lot of NGOs and young initiatives that have emerged as a result and are still alive to date. 2019, 2020, there has been a committee established for single-use plastic bags, and interesting decrees have been implemented. So in March 2019, the Red Sea issued a decree to ban single-use plastic bags and items starting in June 2019. And this was building on a proposal by HEPCA NGO. Specifications was a thickness specification for 25 microns. There were penalties imposed, but the sustainability procedures are challenged. due to the lack of overall mature legal framework, which we are currently working on. Not only the Red Sea, but in November 2019, South Sinai, a decree also followed later, starting March 1st, 2020. And here the thickness requirement was 50 microns, among many other details related to alternatives that are encouraged. And this brings us to the case studies. So after going through what happened in the past, our team went to the two governorates that have implemented these early attempts for bans, and we saw that there are many stakeholders that have very high levels of awareness, whether in the city of Dahab, for example, or in the city of in Sharm el-Sheikh as well, and also in Hurghada, in the Red Sea Governorate. Much of the feedback from the stakeholders was related to the difficulty in understanding the very wide variety of alternatives that are out there. So basically, the consumers are welcoming the ban and they understand the justification, but among the many challenges is we want alternatives. We want to understand what the alternatives are, and this doesn't only mean products, but also lifestyle changes. So alternatives are not only addressing products, such as moving from the thin polyethylene back to a thicker one, or to a strong polypropylene, woven or unwoven bag, multi-use bags. These are product alternatives, but other challenges were related to lifestyle changes as well. So the stakeholders are also very much interested and in need for more understanding of how do we do these lifestyle changes, such as if I'm buying meat, buying frozen products, if I don't have my multi-use bag with me, what do I do? And these are challenges that are shared with other countries that have went through the same experiences, such as Rwanda and Kenya and so on, as I mentioned before. So many of these answers are indeed out there, but we only need some sort of bridging the gap of awareness in terms of either products or lifestyle changes. So this was identified as a gap that we need to work on. And among the very interesting and important observations is the very strong presence of the NGO HEPCA, of course, as many of us know, in many parts of the Red Sea, and the history of awareness raising and cleanup campaigns, and also lobbying for improved regulations to reduce the impact on the environment and also the impact on tourism and the economy and so on. These pictures were kindly shared by HEPCA to help us shed light on the activities that they have been doing. These are cleanups that are onshore and also in underwater, showing how much waste can easily be gathered from a few dives in the sea. So it's not only an issue of open burning and so on, but something that is impacting tourism. One of the key findings was that the biggest issue of concern in these coastal cities is the impact on tourism. And this is the main motivator for welcoming regulations such as bans on free retail distribution or certain types of lightweight bags, thin bags, and so on, and other single-use plastic items. So it was mainly tourism and the impact on the economy. The meetings, in short, were headed by the regional branch offices of the Ministry of Environment in the presence of various supermarket owners, including Carrefour and others, diving centers, boat owners, residents of the cities that we've visited, of course, HEPCA, NGO, and Persega as non-governmental organizations, among others. Key outcomes were that, yes, there are many alternatives that are available. There is awareness that is growing, but the governor's decree was not sufficient for the sustainability of the ban. And we'll talk shortly about the legal tools that have to be in place to ensure that the next attempts for bans and regulations are done in a more sustainable manner. So learning by doing. However, these regulations and this effort and commitment by the governors is very much appreciated, of course, by the environmental stakeholders. The penalties that were imposed were not defined. They were a bit ad hoc. In the Red Sea, for example, out of 63 penalized institutions, shop owners, etc., only 13 paid fines, and various have refused, and others actually sued the governorate, given that it is this decree is legally challenged. And here is where the lessons learned are of most importance. The fines were 5,000 to 10,000 pounds. There are also other laws. There's the cleanliness law of 1962, which was used to invoke these violations. The need for awareness campaigns to include the whole society was quite apparent, meaning to include locals and workers as well. So single-use plastic items is not an issue of tourists and visitors, domestic tourism and so on, but also the locals, the residents, the workers, and so on, to understand what to do, what are the guidelines, what to do. And this is where things like exemptions are important. Certain products are exempt from the bans. Certain situations are addressed, such as, for example, the use of plastic wrapping for protecting food and vegetables, like in the hotel industry and so on. So exempt products, exempt use cases and so on are important, and there is a need to provide more detail on these aspects. Also, the 3 months for compliance was found to be insufficient, so a longer grace period is recommended. And once more, the restrictions and the exposure to this diversity of options should not be a burden for the consumers, but restrictions and the guidelines should mostly target the sources, the shops, the owners, the restaurants, and so on, so that the consumer doesn't have to make decisions all the time that have so many details. What to do when, and what plastic bags are okay, what are not, and so on. So as much as possible, restricting at source. The core objective from this experience developed a bit more. So it is basically limiting the likelihood of carrier bags littering, wind-blown and other, in the marine, river, urban and rural environments and sensitive ecosystems, and facilitating collectability. So it is very important, before delving into details, to understand what the core objectives are in the first place. So if it is limiting carrier bags littering, this means that, okay, we should focus on collection, of course, first, improved collection, and then thickness limitation helps in reducing the likelihood of plastic bags to be blown by the wind and so on, but also improves the likelihood of bags to be used more than once, so improving the quality, thickness, strength, and other properties. This is all related to the objectives. Other countries might have other objectives, such as being focused more on something like recyclability, composting of biodegradable plastic bags, and so on. So it always stems back to the vision first, and then we see how to solve this. With regards to the marine and river litter management in Egypt, there's a lot of progress. National Solid Waste Management Program is supporting the Waste Management Regulatory Authority, established in 2012, and its activities to establish a sustainable and integrated solid waste management system. This program targets 2 governorates in the Delta, Kafr Sheikh and Gharbeya, and 2 in Upper Egypt, Asyut and Ina. And it's experiencing quite steady progress in this respect, including progress in collecting information, conducting assessments, and so on, understanding the problem better among its activities. Littering and dumping in the Nile waters is among key challenges in master plans, such as the dredging costs, like cleaning the waterways, which is of most concern in the Delta governorates. Waste of dredged material, cleaning the waterways, is estimated to be equal to 22% of salt waste generated by adjacent communities, plus sediments, such as in Gharbeya governorate, amongst others. Quantification of such a problem in terms of costs is very important, and this is something that, this is where an opportunity for improving our data lies, quantification in terms of cost. And then impact on tourism in coastal cities is acknowledged, but not quantified as well yet and disclosed. There is improvement in information and data availability, which is in progress, such as through the MEDPOL program for the assessment and control of marine pollution, supporting the compliance with the Barcelona Convention, Horizon 2020 and Persica, among other activities that public authorities are implementing. There's also strong NGO presence and leadership, and lots of emerging younger initiatives as well. So among these younger emerging initiatives, for example, is the Very Nile initiative, co-founded by Greenish, social business of Greenish, and the social enterprise Basita as well. And the associated coalition, Egypt Ban Plastic Coalition, with all its different partners that they've been gathering. Also, other local initiatives are emerging, such as Zero Waste Club Maedi, and also Boy Scouts clubs, and so on. And this is all in partnership and with support of the Ministry of Environment, also the Ministry of Irrigation and other authorities. There is a lot of progress in terms of awareness in all governorates, and we can start seeing this in the young initiatives that are emerging every day. However, the bottleneck, so when we are reflecting on all the case studies that we've been discussing, the bottleneck is one of legal nature. We need a legal framework, sustainable legal framework, when we look at the SWOT analysis of all the case studies, that would enable sustainable progress towards restraining single-use plastic item use and consumption and unnecessary waste and so on. So through a SWOT analysis, we see that there's a positive impact on awareness about the activities done, stimulation of market for alternatives, improved monitoring, reduction in marine litter, and so on. The weakness is limited mandatory power of the decrees that were issued, whether they were issued in the official gazette or not. There is a need to align terminology and specifications in the decrees, and one of the challenges is even in the Arabic translation and the technical terms. No mention of imports, which is off jurisdiction of governor level decrees. The case studies are also of a limited target population of less than 1%. There's a need for specifications and standards. And this was quite apparent when we were discussing about biodegradable plastic bags in specific. So the question was, what are the standards? What do you mean by biodegradable, and so on? Opportunities out there are opportunities in improving the legal framework and the legal tools available. So there is a unified solid waste management law in process. Also, other opportunities can lie in stimulating the development of alternatives, such as through tax incentives. Many voluntary initiatives are out there, which is also an opportunity to leverage these initiatives whether voluntary initiatives by the private sector and NGOs supporting or others. Key threats is the lack of legality of the decree-based penalties that have been issued in the Red Sea and South Sinai, a lack of monitoring capacity, monitoring capacity by law enforcement officials, and technical capacity for specification setting. Insufficiency of grace periods was an issue. For example, what do we do with the existing stocks of bags? How much time do we need to adapt? And so on. Informal sector is a big challenge as well, and the prevalence of black markets that can arise once you impose restrictions that sort of distort the market. Other challenges, we're also settling on terminology, so including Arabization challenge, a translation of words and so on. For example, we noticed that one of the words used, shonat umesh, like cloth bags, were used to refer to bags that were actually made of plastic that look like cloth, like the unwoven polypropylene bags, these soft and tender white bags that have been used as an alternative in some cities, and so on, which is good because they are multi-use bags to some extent, depending on their strength. But this just goes to show us that terminology can be a serious issue, especially when we start looking into legal documents as well. And again, the term biodegradable plastics also has been an issue in terms of translation between English and Arabic. So looking at the industry in Egypt, the majority is blown film extrusion technology. Just a quick overview of the technologies out there. The specifications are set by Egyptian Organization for Standardization. There's currently specifications for high density polyethylene bags, but not low density polyethylene bags. These are the standards that are available. So none yet for LDPE or mixes or polypropylene or others. This is an opportunity for development, and there are many examples of manufacturers, of course, of polyethylene bags in Egypt. Cast film extrusion is the most common process. Among the processes, blown film extrusion is the most common process in Egypt. And if we give you an overview of the different factories or different products that we've been looking into, there are woven bags production facilities producing lots of woven polypropylene bags, non-woven bags, which we found a lot of in the cities that have imposed bans on thin plastic bags, such as in Dahab and so on. There are also other, of course, techniques for plastic bag production, such as melt blowing techniques, full automatic machines for manufacturing of non-woven polypropylene bags, and so on, many of which are abundant in Egypt. So there's an abundance of alternatives. One of the key challenges is the labeling, which is a difficulty for consumers in terms of deciding whether what is the degree of acceptability of these different labels and so on. So degradable and biodegradable here is an example of a discrepancy in the terminology that is used. And this is normal in early stages of development of policies and regulations. And this is one of the things that we are working on. When I say we here, we mean the stakeholders involved, not just, of course, Sideri, under the leadership of the Ministry of Environment and with all the different organizations responsible for standardization. Here, one important thing to mention is that there was quite a large controversy over degradability terminology and certification of degradation when we are talking about oxo-degradable plastics. Oxo-degradable plastics basically is a type of plastic that is degraded with the presence of oxygen and some other parameters as well, which has been banned later in Europe after a lot of controversy. And this is one of the things that are being looked into in Egypt, not just oxo-degradable plastics, but variants and other similar technologies, whether these are technologies that might contribute to prevalence of microplastics in our environment, basically plastics that have not fully degraded and still are persistent in our environment, or not. So one important thing to note is that there is quite a big diversity of different types of plastics of plastic products. They are not everything that is biodegradable, or rather not everything that is based on biomass is biodegradable, and not everything that is biodegradable is necessarily biomass, depending on the technology and innovations that are being developed. So if we take one example, for example, polylactic acid, this is a biodegradable product and also from renewable resources. Polylactic acid is something that is sourced from starch and sugars, fermentation, lactic acid, polylactic acid. And here you have a plastic product that is from renewable resources and also biodegradable. Another example of a challenge that you would find in different types of plastics is that something like the PLA, when you look into its history, involved some controversy because yes, it's biodegradable, and it decomposes, but the challenge is you need an industrial facility with high temperatures. So temperatures above 60, for example. So this goes to show you that not everything that is labeled in a certain way is exactly what you want. So this in a landfill wouldn't properly degrade, and this in a home composting setting would not biodegrade or would not properly biodegrade. So it is not only about biodegradability, but how and to what extent do the different materials degrade. It is normal for any country in early stages of developing regulations related to plastics to have this learning curve, and the learning curve about the diversity of certifications out there. As I mentioned, composting in industrial conditions, for example, as we see in this label that certifies a product, is not the same as composting in the setting of home composting. And also having biodegradable plastics, such as indicated by the Green Pla label of Japan, is not the same as having something such as in this label that is sourced from renewable resources, biomass-based plastic. It can be based on biomass, but not biodegradable. So it simply mimics exactly the same nature of regular fossil fuel-based plastics. But some countries are interested in renewable resources to replace fossil fuel resources. So again, this is all dependent on what vision every country has for its plastic technologies and plastic challenges. Basically, there's a threat of having alternatives offered, but without multi-usability standards in Egypt. So we have this threat in Egypt of this diversity of labels without proper standards for multi-usability. And a very simple example is that in the experience of Kenya and Rwanda, the non-woven plastic bags, which were used as an alternative multi-use bags, they did not have proper standard for multi-usability, and they started becoming very thin, so that they themselves, these strong bags, actually became weak enough to be considered single-use plastic bags, and they have been banned as well. So this goes to show you how important it is to have standards for not only the degradability or biodegradability of your of plastics, but the multi-usability standards for the multi-use plastic bags, which we find is actually more important, as we will explain later. So the focus on multi-usability of plastic bags and reduction of use is actually found in many cases more important than the debate over biodegradability of plastics. And this is in the case of Egypt, where the priority is related to the reduction of litter and the reduction of litter fast. There are many alternatives in Egypt. There's an abundance of alternatives, and there is a misunderstanding that usually happens when we look at the different costs of bags. So the regular bags that you would find in a supermarket can be 20 Egyptian piastres, but you can find other alternatives such as woven polypropylene strong bags that are for £2 for the same size, and sometimes much more expensive, up to 50 Egyptian pounds and more, depending on the quality and the strength and so on. The reason I said misconception is that usually the price is being compared rather than the function. What should indeed be compared is the function, which is how many times are we going to use this bag. Another important thing to note that needs more awareness as well is that other types of materials are not necessarily as environmentally friendly as we think. So for example, paper bags are quite resource intensive, need a lot of resources and energy and water and so on to produce. So they do biodegrade, but at the same time, if you look at the entire life cycle, they are not the best. And also, they are not as multi-usable. You cannot use it many times as much as you can in the case of something like polypropylene bags or other types of bags. So these are a few things that we noted among the misconceptions when we were interviewing the wide range of stakeholders. There are ongoing innovations for biodegradability, however, in many countries, and here we are showing two examples of bio-based, biodegradable material being developed in innovative industries in Japan, such as Mitsubishi Chemicals BioPBS, bio-based polybutylene succinate, which is derived from natural resources such as sugarcane, cassava, and corn. And here it's important to remind that sugarcane, cassava, and corn or other biomass-derived resources doesn't necessarily mean that you are taking away valuable food products from the food industry, but it can always be something that is sourced from waste, for example. A very simple example is that using rice straw which is biomass for energy, is not using biomass that is reducing that is negatively impacting the food industry, but rather it is solving a problem because rice straw is a waste. And this is a case that we've been heavily involved in Egypt as well. So it does not necessarily, but can be related to negative impact on agricultural resources. This material is naturally compostable without requiring specialized composting facilities, and as you can see, it is even home compostable. So with the low temperatures and regular humidity in home composting and so on, this material can biodegrade. And similarly so, another also innovation in one of the Japanese companies, Scaneka, PHBH material, which you can learn a lot more about online, is also a biodegradable and biomass-derived material that is being used. It's actually being used in the garment industry for stores that want to be green and innovative and so on. also used in other functions such as, for example, seedling pod bags, organic waste bags, and so on. And here we wanted to highlight the behavior in the marine environment as well. So one of the important things is that there are innovations available that can degrade quite rapidly in the marine environment, such as the PHBH material, which here is being compared to other technologies, other material types, including PLA. This is not supposed to be a technical presentation, but we would like to just give you a quick overview of the feedback that we have from the various industries in Egypt. So basically, there's a lot of capability in terms of suiting different requirements. When we look at different case studies of companies in Egypt, a lot of them export to many countries in Europe, in Africa, and they adapt to many different requirements, including requirements that relate to also the type of inks that are being used and so on. This is one of the factories that we've been visiting, producing a very wide diversity of polypropylene bags, laminated woven bags, quite a large range of different types of production lines, and so on. Also, companies involving recycling as well, which is quite abundant in Egypt. And this is not to mention the informal industry as well, which is a very large producer of plastic bags in Egypt. As mentioned, a lot of export to many different countries with many requirements showing that there is very good capability in terms of meeting these requirements, and also research and development going on biodegradables. However, one of the big needs that were noted was the support for testing within international standards. So the industry needs support to understand what are the different labels out there, how do we test them, if different regulations are imposed, such as we see in other countries, what are the requirements in terms of the testing facilities and lab facilities, and so on. So these were among the challenges in terms of innovation. There's not much space for innovation for the regular bags, but mostly this was noted for the whole discussion of biodegradable plastic bags. So in summary, the alternatives are there. There are business opportunities low-income countries have managed successfully. Interest from civil society and authorities is evident. There are controversial issues, but they are not a barrier. For example, certification of biodegradable products is not a barrier, but a minor parallel track of activity. So we are quite ready for jumping to the next stages of developing proper regulations. As mentioned before, there are 127 countries around the world that have put in place regulations to address single-use plastic items. So if everything is in place and people are interested, what is the bottleneck? So the bottleneck is indeed that we need a strong and sustainable legal framework. This is what we're working on. So what is the enabling legal framework scenarios? We made a legal study to understand what are the enabling conditions that are needed and what are the recommendations and future prospects. So the purpose of the legal study was to look at scenarios or options on how to best support the legal framework of single-use plastic bags in Egypt. The international legislative of single-use plastic bags was revised in terms of the scope of the bans out there, in terms of technical specifications, in terms of applying incentives or imposing fees, and how this would impact stakeholders in Egypt, in terms of offering a grace period, identifying exceptions from the application of the ban, and also in terms of the legal cover. The current situation is that in the decision of the Red Sea and South Sinai, in the Red Sea province, decisions ban the movement of any marine floating vessel from all Red Sea ports with plastic bags. This was in one decision, and two decisions with regards to banning the use of plastic bags in public shops and pharmacies. For the South Sinai province, two decisions banning the use of single-use plastic bags and to use as alternatives paper bags in shops, restaurants, and pharmacies. Also setting a mechanism and technical specifications of dealing with single-use plastic bags. So what are the scenarios in terms of developing legal frameworks? So scenario one, issuing a special law to deal with single-use plastic bags, and a special law and executive regulations containing all technical details, specifications, and standards to deal with these bags. So the advantages are that in the comprehensive law, you would have detailed legal articles, roles and responsibilities of various governmental and non-governmental entities, and also appropriate penalties, including imprisonment and fines. The disadvantages is that it takes a long time. Preparation and consultation, specialized committees at the parliament and voting and so on. So this would take 1 to 2 years. The second scenario, special legal articles should be added to the solid waste draft law. So the advantage of this, so there's an existing solid waste draft law in process. The advantage is it saves time, 6 to 12 months, legal cover. If we're talking about penalties, legal cover with regards to appropriate penalties and imprisonment and fines. And you still have the ability to have detailed executive regulations. The disadvantages is that the period of issuance would be 6 to 12 months, and it might not be it would not be comprehensive. So this is with regards to a special legal article in the existing ongoing solid waste draft law, especially compared to having scenario one, a special law to deal with single-use plastic items or bags in specific. So scenario three is a decision by the Prime Minister regulating the handling of single-use plastic bags. So the advantages is that it would save time, 3 to 5 weeks, ability to impose administrative sanctions, suspension of the activity, and closure of the facility. But the disadvantages is that it would not include criminal penalties for violating this decision due to the lack of appropriate legislative cover compared with law. So this is in the case of a decision by the Prime Minister. Scenario four is circulating the experience or repeating the experiences of the governorates, so more of these decrees, such as what we saw in South Sinai and Red Sea. But as mentioned before, the disadvantages, which I'll start with, as mentioned before, would be that it would or it cannot include criminal penalties for violating this decision due to the lack of appropriate legislative cover compared with a law. It is not comprehensive, less legislative, a lower legislative instrument in terms of power, and it would lack enforcement. However, the advantage, which is the reason that it has been used in the Red Sea and South Sinai, is that it saves time. It saves time, 3 to 5 weeks. Administrative sanctions can be imposed, such as suspension of activity and closure of the facility. So it is a quick win, and it stimulates the awareness and this early stage of development. Now we reach scenario 5, which we developed, which is basically combining two scenarios, combining a special article in the existing law under development together with a Prime Minister decision. So this is suggested as an optimal scenario where the Prime Minister decision is the quick win, and adding an article to the waste management draft law is the most practical additional measure to improve the legal framework to enable better regulation of single-use plastic bags. To save time, provide legal cover, including imprisonment and fines and so on, and executive regulations. And once more, these are measures that are to protect poor segments of society that have been impacted by tourism, impacted by impact on agriculture, and so on. And these are measures that have been implemented in countries of much lower income as well. There is a possibility to continue awareness raising activities, but unless strong legal measures are not implemented, there will be this perpetual repetition of more awareness and more ad hoc initiatives and so on. So, and also there would not be a proper enabling environment to improve the use of multi-use bags, the use of other alternatives, and the shift in lifestyles that are needed and that are promoted during the awareness campaigns and so on. So it is difficult, but it's something that has to be faced. Once more, for the third time, we mentioned that 127 countries around the globe have indeed implemented certain regulations to restrict single-use plastic bags. So regarding future prospects, recommended follow-ups involve lab capacity upgrades, capacity building, linking to industry, private sector R&D support and piloting, legal support to actually complete this development of the legal framework, and also developing the executive regulations later. Experience exchange seminars are very much needed, especially with countries that have already gone through similar circumstances and have similar levels of income and development and so on, including exchange of country visits. Improvement of data availability for marine and river litter sampling, surveys and associated data and so on, publishing and disclosing existing information, support in technical specifications, information management, database development for the plastic industry, so that information is available upon demand, not requiring repeating surveys and so on. Roadmap and strategy development support, and also single-use plastic items study. So we've been talking about bags. We haven't been talking about items at large, which includes things like cutlery and so on. There is a policy brief that is being circulated that summarizes the parts, especially that are related to policies and the legal framework that is being proposed, and comments are definitely welcome. So in a nutshell, the conceptual roadmap ahead over the next 2 years is that within 2020 it is possible, with the proposed legal instruments, to restrict free retail distribution of single-use plastic bags through the combined measures of Prime Minister decision to restrict free retail distribution, and also technical support to governorates and private stakeholders and NGOs for implementation. Setting standards for carrier bags, including minimum thickness and other reusability and biodegradability standards for other alternatives as deemed necessary. Throughout 2020 to 2021, initiating the inclusion of an article in the solid waste management law restricting single-use plastic bags, preparing executive regulations and parallel capacity building. Also, the government would lead in the implementation of these measures in terms of leading by walking the talk, in terms of aligning public sector services with all the single-use plastic bags restrictions that are in place, such as in different outlets and so on. So in 2022, completing the legal framework development, enforcement, so this will include the executive regulations, and associated technical capacity building. This means completing the development of the executive regulations for the article on single-use plastic bags that would be inserted in the waste management law, published and enforced. as well as building capacity for inspection, auditing, certification, and continued standard setting among competent bodies, such as the National Research Center, Plastic Technology Center, Egyptian Organization for Standardization, and universities, and in cooperation and consultation with the private sector. Complementary measures would be incentivizing alternatives and recycling, fostering cooperation for innovative businesses, which would also include formalization of the informal sectors and so on, and experience exchange and support to grassroots civil society organizations and improving engagement of NGOs. So in final words, we would end this presentation with a paragraph that we mentioned at the start when we distributed our program of the webinar. The new normal of our post-COVID-19 life is a challenge that the world is now racing to plan for, but it can be seen as an opportunity. We can ensure that this new reality of our cities will be characterized by clean air, clean seas and rivers, clean streets and public spaces, and most importantly, improved public health. So there are lots of measures that are a bit difficult to implement, but it is always important to do what's right, not do what's easy. And there is indeed a lot of progress in place by many stakeholders, especially ones working on solid waste management in Egypt, which is excellent. And we hope that this is a very small contribution to the bigger agenda and the bigger roadmap towards a cleaner environment in Egypt, and also healthier cities. And we hope that you also contribute with your comments with a questionnaire that will be distributed to everyone. Thank you very much.